All right, let's get underway. Open your Bibles to Ezra. We're almost through with Ezra. Chapter 9 is where I marked. Is that what you have? Okay, these two books, Ezra and Nehemiah, are about two different men and two different jobs they had to do. Ezra's job was to get the temple rebuilt. Even if it could not approach the grandeur of the one Solomon had built, at least get a temple built on the top of Mount Moriah. When we come to Nehemiah, and we will, of course, this morning, his job was to rebuild the walls of the city. Ancient cities were defenseless if they had no walls and no gates. And Jerusalem had been defenseless for 50 years, from 587 and 586, when the Babylonians destroyed their walls and burned the gates. And in our reading this morning, you will hear them talk about, finally, when the walls were back up, still didn't have gates. They needed both to protect the city at night. There is, north of Haifa, an old Crusader fortress that was built. It's only 1,000 years old. A Crusader fortress. And those of you who are going with us in February, we will show you that 1,000-year-old fortress. And they will show you, and the guide will explain to you, that if you have no walls and no gates, you are defenseless. And the bad people would come in the night while you were sleeping. So you needed walls and gates and watchmen to help keep you safe. All right, I want to go back to something when we were dating all of these things. This week, I ended up being with Rabbi Sherman 3 straight days. Not all day, but on Tuesday, he and I had the board meeting of the Oklahoma Center for Community and Justice. Used to be National Conference of Christians and Jews. And then Wednesday afternoon, we had our Jewish Christian Dialogue group. And then Thursday at noon, we had the Downtown Clergy group. So I was with him 3 times this week. So it gave me some time to talk with him. And I told him, where we were and what we were doing here. And I said, okay, Rabbi, in your community, your faith community, how many of the Israelites went home when the Persians said they could go home? I told you, they didn't all go home. They were established there. And he said, some of our scholars say as few as 10% went home. As few as 10%. That perhaps as many as 90% stayed in Babylon. And when we get to Nehemiah, we're going to find that some had even gone on a little farther east into Persia, because that's where the power was now. The Persians had conquered the Babylonians by this time and let the Jews go home, who wanted to go home. But you see, as I reminded you, if you were a 10-year-old boy or girl, when your family was swept away to Babylon, by the time you're able to go home, you're 60. And you've got children, and you've got grandchildren. And they're established. They have found a job to do. Some way to make a living. Some way to get along. And you remember that the last vision you had of Jerusalem was that these angry Babylonians were stripping the temple of everything of value, stripping the royal palace that Solomon had built of everything of value, and it set fire to both of them. That the armies of the Babylonians were tumbling down the great stone of the walls, and they burned the gates off the hinges. That's the last image you had 50 years before. And now there's commerce, there's some safety, so they didn't go home. Now the reason I mention this to you is that if you were to go to Rabbi Fitzerman's office or Rabbi Sherman's office here in Tulsa, you would find that they both have look like encyclopedias almost, or law books for some of you, commentaries for me. They have a shelf full called the Babylonian Talmud and a shelf called the Jerusalem Talmud. And Talmud is basically commentary on their Holy Writ. They would end up with 39 scrolls, as you know, that are Bible for them. But 5 are more important than the other 34. I mean, there's no question about that. The Torah, contained in the first 5 scrolls, are the most important. And so these are commentaries. And I said, okay, Rabbi, when was the Babylonian Talmud completed? About 600 of the Common Era. AD to some of you. Meaning it was completed 1,000 years after they had been told they could go home. They still hadn't gone home. 1,000 years later. Now, other scholars who did go home produced the Jerusalem Talmud. And it came to completion about the same time. But guess what? Rabbi Sherman says, this one is better. It is generally acknowledged to be better, meaning the best minds didn't go home. These fellows did the best they could. The really good ones didn't come home. So that's what Ezra is up against. That's what Nehemiah is up against. The best ones didn't come home. And perhaps of those who did go home, 10%. About 10% of the people went home. Okay, you clear about that? All right. I thought that might be helpful to you. Let's pray and then we'll get underway here. God, this book of yours means everything to us. We are grateful for the Israelites who produced 39 scrolls, and we're grateful to Christians who produced 27 more for us. These 66 scrolls are so vitally important to us in our knowing as much about you as we can. And we thank you for scholars who have spent adult lifetimes learning what they know and are willing then to teach us. We pray you will help us today find those things that are forever true about you and us, and help us to live out our lives in faithfulness to you. We offer our prayer in the name of your Son, Jesus. Amen. All right. Ezra's job, get the temple rebuilt. He believed God had sent him to get the temple rebuilt. That if the people had a place where worship could be centralized and where the best minds they had could come to teach and to preach, to establish schools, that would be the best thing he could do. That's what he felt. All right, chapter 9. After these things had been done, the officials approached me and said, "The people of Israel, the priests and the Levites, have not separated themselves from the peoples of the lands with their abominations." Okay. Remember that in the time of Moses, he decided that his family would be the priests of the people leaving Egypt. Of the 12 tribes, the sons of Levi would be the priest. So he set his brother Aaron up as the first lead priest, his sister Miriam in a place of real responsibility as well. So Moses, Aaron, and Miriam became the forerunners of the tribe of Levi. Of course, the tribe itself dates all the way back to Jacob, one of the 12 sons. But we had read in 2 Kings that there had come a time when people were being allowed to be priests who weren't Levites, who weren't trained, who didn't know how to do things holy, and the whole system had disintegrated. So Ezra, a part of his job, he believes, is to reinstall, if you would, the Levites as the priest. That perhaps these descendants of that tribe could be held accountable for for teaching the people again the Torah. Remember, most of them could not read nor write. So you needed the Levites. Now comes the indictment. Well, guess what? The Levites have not separated themselves from the indigenous people. They have participated in the abominations. And that, of course, would be the temples to the pagan gods of fertility. These temples that rested at the tops of the hills with their sacred poles representing the male sex organ and so on. Skip with me to verse 2. For they have taken some of their daughters, that means the indigenous folks, the Canaanites, as wives for themselves and for their sons. Thus the holy seed has mixed itself with the peoples of the lands, and in this faithlessness the officials and leaders have led the way. When I heard this, I tore my garment. Okay, remember, a sign of being undone, of grieving. I tore my garment and my mantle, like a stole, if you would, and pulled hair from my head and beard, and sat appalled. Then all who trembled at the words of the Elohim of Israel, because of the faithlessness of the returned exiles, gathered around me while I sat appalled, and until the evening sacrifice. We just sat there, speechless, silent, grieving. Okay, now I want to remind you of something that we've said before. The Hebrew Scriptures do not speak with one voice on the matter of marrying foreigners. It doesn't speak with one voice. When Naomi and her husband went over to the land of Moab with their 2 sons, what happened? The 2 sons married Moabite women. Remember? The Moabites were not Jews. They were not Israelites. They were one of the tribes of the indigenous Canaanite peoples. And one of those Moabite women would come home with Naomi after the husband and both sons had died. Orpah went back to her people, but Ruth went home with Naomi. And Naomi's cousin exercised the right to look after this widow woman and this younger widow woman, her daughter-in-law, and ended up marrying her. And, of course, Ruth became the great-grandmother of King David. All right, so she was a foreigner, Ruth. No doubt about it. The Bible is very clear about that. Now, today, a passage condemning those who have married foreign wives. Non-Israelite. That's all. Non-Israel. Gentiles. Marrying Gentile women. In the 39 scrolls, you can find that whenever the people feel threatened, that they may be losing their identity, their leaders forbid them to marry foreigners. When they are feeling comfortable, secure, interfaith marriage is allowed. Okay, let me try to help you understand Tulsa, Oklahoma. I feel very close to both of the rabbis. I'm even closer to Charles than I am to Mark. Gail and I, have gone out to dinner with the Shermans. We love them. They're very special friends. We've eaten Passover in their home. We were in their home last spring when Rabbi Zimmerman came. The Shermans that Friday evening fed us in their home, and then we all went to Sabbath services, and Rabbi Zimmerman spoke at Temple Israel, and we got to hear him there and so on. They're wonderful, dear friends. But not so long ago, one of our young women in this church got engaged to a young man who was Jewish, and the family asked, would I get one of my rabbi friends to participate in the wedding? And our 2 rabbis in Tulsa say, we will not do it. We will not do it. And the reason being, they both say, when we have a Jew who marries a Gentile, we lose a Jew. Almost every time. And we are being outnumbered more and more and more in the world. We are not reproducing ourselves with our birth rates. They say we're not reproducing ourselves. And so it's a sham for us to participate and give our blessing to a union that we believe is going to cause us to lose. We're going to lose a member of our faith community, male or female. So sorry, we will not. Now, there are rabbis who will, but our two here will not. And I told the family they would not. I said, they're very special friends of ours, but they will not participate in a mixed marriage. Now, if persons are already married and husband or wife wants to participate in temple or synagogue, of course they're welcome. Very much so. But they believe that participating in the wedding is contributing to the demise of the Jewish people in America. And so they will not do that. Again, there are other rabbis who will, but these two feel very strongly about that. And I understand what they're saying. It even happens within Christendom. Sometimes you have a Roman Catholic and a Protestant. And not in every case, but in some, they end up going nowhere. The Protestant doesn't really feel comfortable in the Roman Catholic liturgies and so on, and the Roman Catholic can't find comfort in the Protestant. And both faith communities may miss out. So I simply want you to know that, or remind you, I've told you this before, there are passages in the 39 scrolls where marriage takes place between Israelites and non-Israelites. But there are also passages like this one, when if only 10% of them have come home, and they have found the indigenous people have reasserted themselves over the best watering holes and the best farming land and the best olive groves, you can see how threatened they feel. And furthermore, they know what happened 150 years before to the northern tribes. They gave up and gave in and intermarried with the Assyrians until they ceased to be a separate people. They were lost to history. Okay, so yes. Question was, does it matter if the individual converts? If the Gentile will convert to Judaism, they would participate, yeah, but not in a mixed marriage. Not if one's Christian, one's Jew, and neither has converted. And of course, if the Jew converts to Christianity, they certainly wouldn't participate. But if it works the other way around, anyone may convert to Judaism. Both rabbis say the first thing they do if somebody says, I would like to join your temple or your synagogue, I'm not a Jew, have you lost your mind? Have you lost your mind? Do you know how many people there are in the world who absolutely hate us? Who dream up all kinds of reasons why they think they ought to hate us. You sure you want to join us? Okay, but you can convert, and of course if both were Jews, then they would certainly do the ceremony, but not in a Jewish Christian ceremony. Okay. We still do participate in the mixed Jew and Christian. But even there, as Christians, we say to the couple, we're going to use our Methodist service, which mentions the Lord Jesus Christ at least a half dozen times. If you get married at Boston Avenue, we're going to use the Methodist service. So that's, we think understanding each other is one thing. Deep and genuine appreciation of each other is important. But our two faith communities are not identical. They are not identical. And in these really significant passages of life, those differences often exert themselves. I am not saying that couples cannot marry one Jew, one Gentile, and get along well. We have several in this church who have proven that can happen and happen remarkably well. Of course, if children come along, you've got a whole other problem then. Are they bar mitzvahed and bat mitzvahed, or are they baptized and confirmed? And often the children can be very confused about that. But I won't point out who, but we had a woman who joined our church within the last month whose husband is Jewish. And they had moved here to Tulsa. I met both of them, and I simply said, I believe as long as I'm pastor here, you will never be embarrassed at Boston Avenue Church. You would never feel put upon at Boston Avenue Church. You would never hear mean, hateful, unaccepting language from me or anyone on our staff against the Jewish people. I think you would feel comfortable here, and whenever you want to come with her, we hope you will feel comfortable doing that. He said, thank you very much. So we do have couples where they've done that pretty well, but the rabbis are not convinced that enough of them end well that they want to participate. Okay, verse 5. So we just sat there all afternoon, Ezra says. I've torn my clothes. I'm undone by this. At the evening sacrifice, I got up from my fasting with my garments and my mantle torn and fell on my knees, spread out my hands to Yahweh, my Elohim, and said, O my Elohim, I am too ashamed and embarrassed to lift my face to you, my Elohim, for our iniquities have risen higher than our heads, and our guilt has mounted up to the heavens. From the days of our ancestors to this day, we have been deep in guilt, and for our iniquities, we, our kings, and our priests have been handed over to the kings of the lands, to the sword, to captivity, to plundering, and to utter shame, as is now the case. But now for a brief moment, favor has been shown by Yahweh, our Elohim, who has left us a remnant, maybe only 10%, and given us a stake in His set-apart place, in order that He may brighten our eyes and grant us a little sustenance in our slavery. For we are slaves. Yet our Elohim has not forsaken us in our slavery, but has extended to us His chesed before the kings of Persia, to give us new life, to set up the house of our Elohim, to repair its ruins, and to give us a wall in Judea and Jerusalem. And now, our Elohim, what shall we say after this? For we have forsaken your commandments, which you commanded by your servants the prophets, saying, the land that you're entering to possess is a land unclean, with the pollutions of the peoples of the lands, with their abominations. They have filled it from end to end with their uncleanness. Therefore do not give your daughters to their sons, neither take their daughters for your sons, and never seek their peace or prosperity, so that you may be strong and eat the good of the land, and leave it for an inheritance to your children forever. After all that has come upon us for our evil deeds and for our great guilt, seeing that you, our Elohim, have punished us less than our iniquities deserved, and have given us such a remnant as this, shall we break your commandments again and intermarry with the peoples who practice these abominations? Would you not be angry with us until you destroy us without remnant or survivor? O Yahweh, Elohim of Israel, you are just, but we have escaped as a remnant, as is now the case. Here we are before you in our guilt, though no one can face you because of this. He's got his face prostrate down on the ground. Okay, let's go on with chapter 10. Now while Ezra prayed and made confession, weeping and throwing himself down before the house of Elohim, a very great assembly of men, women, and children gathered to him out of Israel. The people also wept bitterly. And they addressed Ezra, saying, we have broken faith with our God and have married foreign women from the peoples of the land. But even now there is hope for Israel in spite of this. So now let us make a covenant with our God to send away all these wives and their children, according to the counsel of my Lord, and of those who tremble at the commandment of our Elohim, and let it be done according to the Torah. Take action, for it is your duty, and we are with you. Be strong and do it. And Ezra stood up and made the leading priest, the Levites, and all Israel swear that they would do as had been said. So they swore. Skip to verse 9. Then all the people of Judah and Benjamin, those are the two tribes remaining, assembled at Jerusalem. Look at the latter part of that verse. All the people sat in the open square before the house of Elohim, trembling because of this matter and because of the heavy rain. Then Ezra the priest stood up and said to them, You have trespassed and married foreign women, and so increased the guilt of Israel. Now make confession to Yahweh, Elohim of your ancestors, and do His will. Separate yourselves from the peoples of the land and from the foreign wives. Then all the assembly answered with a loud voice, It is so. We must do as you have said. But the people are many, and it's a time of heavy rain. We cannot stand in the open. Nor is this a task for one day or for two, for many of us have transgressed in this matter. Let our officials represent the whole assembly, and let all in our towns who have taken foreign wives come at appointed times. So they're going to have ceremonies in which they tell the wives and the children, Go back to your people. Of course, they're their children too, of course. I mean, these guys have fathered these children, and now they're telling them, Take them away. Verse 16. Then the returned exiles did so. Ezra the priest selected men, heads of families, according to their families, each of them designated by name. And on the first day of the 10th month, they sat down to examine the matter. And by the first day of the first month, they had come to the end of all the men who had married foreign women. Look at the very last verse of this book of Ezra. Verse 44. All these had married foreign women, and they sent them away with their children. It's hard. It's really hard. Ezra felt he was doing the right thing. That if they did not set themselves apart, they would cease to be a separate people. They would just blend in and assimilate into everybody else. And so the word that's used today by Jews is the word observant. Are you an observant Jew, or are you not observing? I mean, just having Jewish blood isn't enough. Are you observant? Do you do Torah? Could have been rejected by their families. More likely not, I think. I know that women had to fend for themselves, and if they had no man to fend for them, they were in desperate straits. No, we don't know exactly what happened to them, whether their families did re-embrace them and welcome them home and look after the children. We don't know for sure. Stories are written by the winners, by the men, and in this case. Okay, we're ready to move to Nehemiah. Everybody ready? That's all you're going to hear about that story. Okay, Nehemiah has moved on farther east from Babylon into Persia. And again, the Jews were capable people, and they, at their best, had real discipline, a work ethic, we say today, and so had done well. And here we find Nehemiah, who is cupbearer to the king, meaning the king trusted him. Everything he drank, he believed was good because Nehemiah presented it. Nobody was poisoning him and so on. And word comes to Nehemiah in Persia, modern-day Iran, that Ezra has accomplished much, but the walls are still tumbled down and there are no gates on the hinges. Okay, that's his problem. That's Nehemiah's problem as he experiences it. So let's start with chapter 1. We're going to read a fair amount of this because I think you need to hear how difficult it was. As we move on, in chapter 3, I don't have very many verses, but I think you need to know how difficult it was. And those of you who are going to get to see Jerusalem in February, of course you're not looking at Nehemiah's walls. You're not looking at Nehemiah's walls. In fact, other enemies came. The Muslims devastated much of the city as well. What was long called the Weeping Wall, where Jewish men came up and put their little prayers into the cracks. Those stones, huge, date back to the time of Herod the Great, back to the time of Jesus. It's no longer called the Wailing Wall because the Jews now are in control of the city of Jerusalem. It's called the Western Wall now, the Western Wall of the Temple Mount. And, of course, the walls have been reestablished centuries ago now. But after the time of Herod the Great, only the biggest ones at the very base were not moved. Those are still original, that far back. Not to Nehemiah's time, to King Herod's time, in the time of Jesus. Okay? All right. The words of Nehemiah, son of Hakaliah. In the month of Chislev, in the 20th year, while I was in Susa, the capital, one of my brothers, Hanani, came with certain men from Judah, and I asked them about the Jews that survived, those who had escaped the captivity, and about Jerusalem. They replied, the survivors there in the province who escaped captivity are in great trouble and shame. The wall of Jerusalem is broken down, and its gates have been destroyed by fire. When I heard these words, I sat down and wept and mourned for days, fasting and praying before the Elohim of heaven. Okay, he knows that for him to do anything about this is going to change his life forever. If he's to give up a place of real responsibility in the court of the Persians and go to such a devastated place, it will change his life and that of his family forever. So he spends days grieving about this news he's received, praying, fasting, seeking divine guidance. Verse 5, I said, Oh, I am who I am, Elohim of heaven, great and awesome God who keeps covenant and chesed with those who love him and keep his commandments. Let your ear be attentive and your eyes open to hear the prayer of your servant that I now pray before you day and night for your servants, the people of Israel, confessing the sins of the people of Israel, which we have sinned against you. Skip to verse 8. Remember the word that you commanded your servant Moses. If you are unfaithful, I will scatter you among the peoples. But if you return to me and keep my commandments and do them, though your outcasts are under the farthest skies, I will gather them from there and bring them to the place at which I have chosen to establish my name. The very last sentence of chapter 1 now tells you, at the time I was cupbearer of the king. Wow. He's being asked, he believes by God, to change his life forever. Let's go on. Chapter 2. In the month of Nisan, in the 20th year of King Artaxerxes, remember the one who had first let them go home was King Cyrus. Okay, but Cyrus has died, and Artaxerxes is now king. We remember the correspondence back in the book of Ezra between those who tried to convince King Artaxerxes that the Jews were rebels, could not be controlled if you let them go home, and they were home. at least 10% of them or so were home, they will rise up against you. They are a stiff-necked people. They do not submit to tyranny or to your leadership and so on. So Artaxerxes had to struggle with that and eventually went back in the records, and there it was written, King Cyrus did tell them they could go home and rebuild their city. Okay. In the 20th year of King Artaxerxes, when wine was served him, I carried the wine and gave it to the king. Now, I had never been sad in his presence before. I mean, a servant's job is to be upbeat, right? King's got enough problems. He doesn't want to hear about yours. But this time, he cannot mask his feelings. That's what he's trying to tell you. So the king said to me, why is your face sad, since you are not sick? This can only be sadness of the heart. Pretty observant old boy, wouldn't you say? Then I was very much afraid. Okay. He's going to tell the king what he thinks he's got to do. And he doesn't know how the king will react to that. I was very much afraid. I said to the king, may the king live forever. That's a good beginning, right? May the king live forever. Long live the king. That's the only. Why should my face not be sad? When the city, the place of my ancestors' graves, lies waste, and its gates have been destroyed by fire. The king said to me, what do you request? We'd say, well, what do you want me to do about that? So I prayed to the Elohim of heaven. You ever been in one of those moments when you're praying, oh, God, help me say the right thing here? Okay, that's what he's saying. I prayed to God, I would say the right thing, and said to the king, if it pleases the king, and if your servant has found favor with you, I ask that you send me to Judah, to the city of my ancestors' graves, so that I may rebuild it. The walls and the gates, that's what he's concerned about. The king said to me, the queen also was sitting beside him, how long will you be gone? When will you return? So it pleased the king to send me, and I set him a date. I said to the king, if it pleases the king, let letters be given to me to the governors of the province beyond the river. He's going to have to go beyond the Tigris-Euphrates, that they may grant me passage until I arrive in Judah. And a letter to Asaph, the keeper of the king's forest, directing him to give me timber to make beams for the gates of the temple fortress and from the wall of the city and for the house that I shall occupy. And the king granted me what I asked, for the gracious hand of my Elohim was upon me. Okay? I've never forgotten our first trip to Israel, how for 10 days we heard people talk about blessed, blessed, blessed. How blessed, how blessed, how blessed. And we went straight across to Greece, and everybody started talking about lucky they were, how lucky they were. That's not an indictment of all Greeks. But there was a difference. Which one do you hear more in America? Lucky? Even fortunate? Or blessed? Here, Hezekiah believes if things are beginning to pan out for him, God's at work. God is at work. And God is what? Gracious. Giving me more than I deserve. Giving us more than I deserve. Skip to verse 11. We won't deal with every little trial and tribulation here. I came to Jerusalem and was there for 3 days. He's walking around looking 3 days. Then I got up during the night because he's aware that others may be watching him to see what he's about to do. I and a few men with me, I told no one what my Elohim had put into my heart to do for Jerusalem. The only animal I took was the animal I rode. So he's on some little burro or something. He's going to inspect the city at night. I mean, he can get in and out. There are no gates. There are no walls. He can go where he wants to unless somebody prevents it. I went out by night by the valley gate, past the dragon spring, and to the dung gate, And I inspected the walls of Jerusalem that had been broken down, and its gates that had been destroyed by fire. The dung gate, still there. Still there. A place of refuse, a place of animal manure, and so on. One was called the Sheep's Gate, where the sheep's pens were. Most of the gates were named for the direction one went if one went out that gate. There was a Damascus Gate, a Caesarean Gate, if you would, and the King's Gate on the east side, and so on. The Lion's Gate, the Lion of Judah, and so on. All right, so he's riding this burro around, taking a good look at what's not been done, what needs to be done. Then I went up to the fountain gate and to the king's pool, but there was no place for the animal I was riding to continue. So I went up by way of the valley by night and inspected the wall. Then I turned back and entered by the valley gate, and so returned. The officials did not know where I had gone or what I was doing. I had not yet told the Jews, the priests, the nobles, the officials, and the rest that were to do the work. Even those I'm going to count on to help me get this done, I haven't told them yet. For 3 days, he's been just looking. Then I said to them, "You see the trouble we're in? How Jerusalem lies in ruins with its gates burned? Come, let us rebuild the wall of Jerusalem so that we may no longer suffer disgrace." I told them that the hand of my Elohim had been gracious upon me, and also the words that the king had spoken to me. And they said, "Let's start building." So they committed themselves to the common good. Isn't that a good sentence? They committed themselves to the common good. Every Jew will be better off if we get the walls rebuilt and the gates hung again at the openings. Skip to chapter 3, verse 1. Then the high priest, Eliashib, set to work with his fellow priest and rebuilt the sheep gate. Verse 3. The sons of Hasinah, built the fish gate. Verse 5. Next to them the Tekoites made repairs, but their nobles would not put their shoulders to the work of their Yahweh. The poor people are working hard, not all of those who are above it in their eyes. Okay, I don't think that chapter 3 it was probably important to the people who first read it or heard it read to them, because, my uncle was there, my aunt was there, and my grandfather was there, but not to you and me. Let's skip to chapter 4. Now when Sanballat heard that we were building the wall, he was angry and greatly enraged, and he mocked the Jews. Look at the end of verse 2. What are these feeble Jews doing? Will they restore things? Will they sacrifice? Will they finish it in a day? Will they revive the stones out of the heaps of rubbish, and burned ones at that? That stone wall they're building, any fox going up on it would break it down. That's discouraging, huh? All this work you're trying to do, an animal small as a fox jump up and break it down. You think you're going to have protection? You're not going to have protection. You don't know what you're doing. But Hezekiah is capable. Look at verse 6. So we rebuilt the wall, and all the wall was joined together to half its height. Not full yet, but at least a wall all the way around half as tall as it was. For the people had a mind to work. I love that sentence too. But when Sanballat and Tobiah and the Arabs and the Ammonites and the Ashdodites heard that the repairing of the walls of Jerusalem was going forward and the gaps were beginning to be closed, they were very angry. And all plotted together to come and fight against Jerusalem and to cause confusion in it. So we prayed to our Elohim and set a guard as a protection against them day and night. But Judah said, the strength of the burden bearers is failing. There's too much rubbish so that we're unable to work on the wall. And our enemies said, they will not know or see anything before we come upon them and kill them and stop the work. Skip to verse 13. So in the lowest parts of the space behind the wall, in open places, I stationed the people according to their families, with their swords, their spears, and their bows. After I looked these things over, I stood up and said to the nobles and the officials and the rest of the people, "Do not be afraid of them. Remember the I am, who is great and awesome. Fight for your kin, your sons, your daughters, your wives, and your homes." When our enemies heard that their plot was known to us and that Elohim had frustrated it, we all returned to the wall, each to his work. However, from that day on, half of my servants worked on construction, while half held the spears, shields, bows, and body armor. And the leaders posted themselves behind the whole house of Judah who were building the wall. The burden bearers carried their loads in such a way that each labored on the work with one hand and with the other held a weapon. And each of the builders had his sword strapped at his side while he built. The man who sounded the shofar was beside me, and I said to the nobles, the officials, and the rest of the people, verse 20, "Rally to us wherever you hear the sound of the shofar. Our Elohim will fight for us." So we labored at the work, and half of them held the spears from break of dawn until the stars came out. I also said to the people at that time, "Let every man and his servant pass the night inside Jerusalem, so that they may be a guard for us by night and may labor by day." So neither I, nor my brothers, nor my servants, nor the men of the guard who followed me ever took off our clothes. Each kept the weapon in his right hand. So they're doing what they have to do to protect themselves. Not even getting undressed to sleep. Sleeping in their clothes in case the enemy should come. And up the next morning, working again. Okay? When you who are going to Israel in February get there, at first I think it'll be unsettling for you to see teenagers, 18, 19, walking around with automatic Uzis on their shoulder. They may be wearing blue jeans. They're not always in army uniform. But every young person in Israel, male and female, serve in the armed forces. They go through basic training. They serve an active duty. Women 2 years, young men 3. But they are on active reserve until they're 55. They can be summoned at any moment. And they're all bearing arms. They're all bearing arms. Then I think you'll feel safe and secure. I've slept very well when I've been in Israel. I have felt they were really looking after me. Our bishop had scheduled a retreat Thursday afternoon until Saturday noon at Camp Egan. He had others at Kenyon Camp and Cross Point earlier in the week. But one of the associate ministers at Faith Church here in Tulsa was one of my students when I was teaching doctrine for Phillips Seminary when they first moved from Enid to Tulsa. 10 years I taught that doctrine course one afternoon a week until they hired Methodist professors onto the faculty. Their president now is a United Methodist. Anyway, she was one of my students back when I was teaching doctrine. And she came up to me at the lunchtime and said, "I've just gotten back from Israel." And I said, "Really? What did you think?" And you know the first thing she said? "It's so tiny." I have said ever since my first trip there, no person in the United States Congress, House of Representatives or Senate, should be allowed to have an opinion or cast a vote if they've not been to Israel. I don't think there's any way they can look at a map and understand it's only 50 miles from the Sea of Galilee to the Jordan River. From here to Stroud. And it's only 90 miles north to south. And there are rockets in countries controlled by 70 million Arabs who can be there in seconds over Israel. In seconds. I don't think you get to vote till you've been there. Have a look. See what you're talking about. Often what you don't know about, you're talking anyway. Okay, so it was difficult. Difficult for the 10% maybe who went home again to get there and have the indigenous people have reasserted themselves and taken over. Let's skip to chapter 6. Yeah, we've got a little more time. So they're working with one hand and have a weapon in the other. They have guards over them at night, but if the shofar, this ram's horn sounds, jump up, be ready to fight our enemies. Now when it was reported to Sanballat and Tobiah and to Geshem the Arab and to the rest of our enemies that I had built up the wall and that there was no gap left in it, notice here though, a little disclaimer, though up to that time I had not set up the doors and the gates. Oh, we had the walls up, but we don't have the gates yet. Okay. Sanballat and Geshem sent to me, saying, "Come and meet us together in one of the villages in the plain of Ono." But they intended to do me harm. Have you seen The Godfather? You remember Marlon Brando's character? Shortly before he dies, he says to Michael, "The one who proposes the meeting is the traitor." The one who proposes the meeting is the traitor. It was Abe Vigoda. You remember? Yeah, he was the one who came and said, "We need to have a meeting." Michael remembered. The one who sets up the meeting. He is the traitor. Okay. They intended to do me harm. They don't want to meet and talk and come to agreement. They intended to do me harm. So I sent messengers to them saying, "I'm doing a great work. I cannot come down. Why should the work stop while I leave it to come down to you?" They sent to me 4 times in this way, and I answered them in the same manner. In the same way, Sanballat, for the 5th time, sent his servant to me with an open letter in his hand. In it was written, "It is reported among the nations," and Geshem also says it. And the nations here means the small tribal groups. We're not talking something as big as the United States or Canada or any such thing. We're talking about these tribal groups that live in Canaan. "That you and the Jews intend to rebel. That's why you're building the wall. And according to this report, you wish to become their king." So he's really trying to get under Hezekiah's skin here. But verse 8, "Then I sent to him saying, 'No such things as you say have been done. You're inventing them out of your own mind.' For they all wanted to frighten us, thinking, 'Their hands will drop from the work, drooping hands, and it will not be done. But now, O Elohim, strengthen my hands.'" Skip to verse 15. "So the wall was finished." Verse 16, "And when all our enemies heard of it, all the nations around us were afraid and fell greatly in their own esteem, for they perceived that this work had been accomplished with the help of our Elohim." Remember, in that time, whoever's winning was thought to have the greater God. That's what the priests were so frightened about when they first were carried off to Babylon. Since the Babylonians have become so strong and are dominating the whole Middle East at that time, in the 6th century, back here, then they were afraid the people would say, "Then their God must be the right one. Their God must be the right one." And so the real question was, will they bow down to Marduk or not? The Babylonian god. Will they or not? But see, now it works in the Jews' favor. We've got our temple rebuilt. Now we've got our walls rebuilt, and we're hanging the gates. Maybe our God has power. And even those who are not Israelite, who are not Jews, are saying the same. Wow. Maybe their God is more than we gave him credit for. You see how the brain worked? That's the way it worked in those times. So, do they leave our God and go to Marduk or not? Now that they're home again, will any of these indigenous people recognize the power of Israel's God? Let's skip to chapter 7. Now when the wall had been built, and I had set up the doors, and the gatekeepers, the singers, and the Levites had been appointed, I gave my brother Hanani charge over Jerusalem, along with Hananiah, the commander of the citadel. You know, citadel is just the palace, okay, the fortress around the palace. For he was a faithful man and feared Elohim more than many. And I said to them, the gates of Jerusalem are not to be open until the sun is hot. He meant by that, let people get a good night's sleep. Be sure the sun is up where we could see enemies if they're there. While the gatekeepers are still keeping guard, let them shut and bar the doors. And appoint guards from among the inhabitants of Jerusalem, some at their watchposts and others before their own houses. The city was wide and large, but the people within it were few, and no houses had been built. Oh no, he has a city with nice new walls and gates and nobody living inside. Virtually nobody. So he's got another problem. You got another problem. How are you going to re-inhabit the city? How are you going to talk people into moving downtown? How do you get them to come back downtown? Well, you tell them you don't have to pay any city taxes for 6 years. That's one way. Look at verse 73, chapter 7. So the priests, and he's reestablished this one tribe, Levites, the gatekeepers, the singers, some of the people, the temple servants, and all Israel settled in their towns, not Jerusalem. So he's still got a problem. How am I going to get people to come to the city, which now has walls, which now has gates, which now has a temple? How do we get them to leave their towns and come to the city? We'll have to deal with that next week. So, if you haven't been to church, don't rush off. Chapter 8, that will be October the 3rd already.